There are some things that never leave a man, no matter how famous he becomes, no matter how many times the world applauds his name, no matter how many decades pass between the moment it happened and the morning he wakes up still thinking about it. There are debts that cannot be paid with money, wounds that cannot be closed with time, and truths so heavy that the only way to survive carrying them is to pretend, for as long as possible, that they don't exist at all. John Wayne knew this better than most men. He had built an entire life on the image of someone who never flinched, never begged, never broke. And yet, on one particular evening, in a room that smelled of old wood and cigarette smoke and something that felt uncomfortably like fate, the most iconic tough man in Hollywood history sank to his knees in front of Dean Martin and said words that neither of them would ever fully recover from. What happened between these two men has been whispered about for decades. People who were there describe it differently depending on who you ask, and most of them have reasons not to tell the whole truth. But when you pull back every layer of loyalty and carefully constructed legend, what you find underneath is something rawer and more human than anything either man ever performed on screen. This is the story of a friendship built in the fire of ambition, tested by the kind of silence that destroys things quietly, and ultimately cracked open by a confession so unexpected that even the man receiving it didn't know how to breathe for a long moment afterward. To understand what happened that night, you have to go back much further than most people realize. You have to go back to a version of Hollywood that no longer exists, a world where men made deals with handshakes and kept secrets with their lives, where reputation was everything and vulnerability was something you buried so deep that even your closest friends never saw it surface. John Wayne had been building his fortress long before he ever crossed paths with Dean Martin. By the time their lives intersected in any meaningful way, Wayne had already spent years constructing a version of himself so impenetrable that even people who loved him sometimes wondered if the real man was still inside somewhere, still breathing, still feeling anything at all. Wayne had come from nothing, and the nothing he came from had taught him one lesson above everything else. Weakness was a door you left open at your own risk. His father had been a man of modest means and fragile health, and watching that fragility become a defining fact of their family's life had burned something permanent into the boy who would become John Wayne. He decided early and with iron conviction that he would never be that. He would never be the man people pitied. He would never be the one on his knees. That decision served him extraordinarily well for a very long time. It made him a star. It made him a legend. And it made him, in ways he couldn't fully see until much later, profoundly alone. Dean Martin arrived in Hollywood from a completely different angle. Where Wayne had climbed with grim determination, Martin seemed to float upward on something that looked effortless from the outside. The voice, the smile, the way he occupied a room as though the room had been personally designed for his comfort. People who work with Martin often described him as one of the most naturally charming human beings they had ever encountered. And then, almost without exception, they would pause and add something else. Something about how hard it was to actually know him. Something about the distance he kept behind the warmth. Something about the sense that the real Dean Martin was standing slightly behind the Dean Martin everyone saw, watching, assessing, never fully arriving. In this way, the two men were more alike than either of them would have admitted. They had both constructed magnificent public selves that functioned as armor. They had both learned to keep the most important parts of themselves hidden so thoroughly that the hiding had become as natural as breathing. And when they eventually came into each other's orbit through a particular gravitational pull of the film industry and the social world that surrounded it, there was a recognition between them that neither man put into words but both men felt. The recognition of someone who understood what it cost to maintain an image and what you sacrificed to keep it intact. Their professional relationship began with mutual respect of the careful, measured kind that exists between two powerful men who are not yet sure what the other wants. Wayne was already an institution. Martin was ascending, riding the enormous cultural wave of his partnership with Jerry Lewis, and then, after that partnership ended in a rupture that devastated Martin more than he ever publicly acknowledged, charting his own course with remarkable success. By the time they began working in close proximity, both men were at the height of their respective powers, and both men were carrying things they hadn't told anyone. The project that brought them into genuine intimacy was the kind of Western that only existed in that particular era, shot in the amber light of the American Southwest with a cast assembled from the highest tier of Hollywood royalty. The days on set were long and physical, and shot through with a particular camaraderie that develops between men who are working hard together in beautiful and uncomfortable places. At night, the cast and crew would gather in whatever makeshift social space the location afforded, and this was where the real texture of relationships was formed. Wayne dominated those evenings the way he dominated everything, with a boisterous authority that was half genuine warmth and half performance. Even when there was no audience that mattered, he told stories. He laughed with a fullness that seemed to fill whatever room he was in. He drank, not recklessly but steadily, with the ease of a man who had learned to use alcohol the way some men use armor, as something that softened the edges of things that were otherwise too sharp to touch. And Martin, for his part, watched all of this with those dark, intelligent eyes and occasionally said something so quietly accurate and so unexpected that Wayne would go still for a moment before laughing again, a slightly different laugh the second time, one that had more truth in it. There was a night, early in the production, when the two of them ended up alone on the porch of a rented house after everyone else had gone to bed. The desert was doing what desert nights do, which is to say, to become enormous and cold and full of stars in a way that makes ordinary human concerns feel simultaneously more and less significant. Wayne had a drink in his hand. Martin had put his down on the railing and wasn't reaching for it. And somehow, without either of them quite steering the conversation there, they began talking about the war. This was not an unusual topic for men of their generation, but the way they talked about it that night was unusual. At least for John Wayne. Wayne had not served in the Second World War. This was a fact that had followed him his entire career, like a shadow that grew longer toward the end of the day. He had been granted a deferment. And then another one. And while other men from Hollywood had gone and come back changed or hadn't come back at all, Wayne had stayed and made movies and become the most iconic symbol of American military valor that the culture produced. The gap between what he represented and what he had actually done was something he had never, in any public forum, addressed with the kind of honesty it deserved. But on that porch, in that desert, something different happened. Martin had served, not in combat, but he had been there, part of the machinery of it, and he had known men who didn't come home, and there was a weight in him when the subject arose that was different from the easy charm he wore everywhere else. Wayne had started talking about something else, some anecdote about a director, but his voice had shifted in the middle of it, and Martin had noticed a shift. And when Wayne trailed off, Martin had simply waited in that particular way. He had a waiting, patient, and complete that somehow made it easier to say the next thing. What Wayne said in the silence that followed was the beginning of something, not the confession itself. Not yet, but the first crack in the wall, the first small true thing offered across the space between them. He said that there were things about his own image that he had never been comfortable with, that the gap between who he appeared to be and what he had actually done or failed to do was something that visited him at particular hours of the night with consistency he had never found a way to diminish. He didn't say it that cleanly or that precisely. He said it the way a man says something he has never said before, in pieces, with long pauses, occasionally turning away to look at the desert as though the desert were helping. Martin listened. This was, it turns out, one of Dean Martin's great and underappreciated gifts. He knew how to listen in a way that made the speaker feel neither judged nor managed. He didn't offer comfort too quickly. He didn't rush to fill the silences with reassurance. He just stayed there, present and steady, and let Wayne say what Wayne was finding his way towards saying. And when Wayne was finished, what Martin said was simple and direct, and given how rarely either of these men spoke this way to each other, absolutely devastating in its honesty. He said that he had his own version of that weight, and that in his experience it didn't get lighter with time, it just got more familiar, which was not the same thing at all. That night was a foundation of something. Not the full story, not the confession that would eventually come, but the ground it would eventually be built on. The two men went to their separate rooms, and the next morning everything was the same as it had been on the surface. The banter and the work and particular social rhythms of a film in production. But something had shifted underneath. Something had been acknowledged. And once a thing like that is acknowledged between two men who spend most of their lives keeping things unacknowledged, it creates a kind of pressure that builds very slowly, and then eventually, all at once, the months that followed brought them in and out of each other's proximity in the way that the lives of people who move in the same professional circles inevitably do. They had dinners together, attended the same events, found themselves at the same parties in houses and hills where the city spread out below, like a promise someone had made and only partially kept. Their friendship deepened in the way that friendships between very busy and very guarded men deepen, which is to say slowly and with occasional startling moments of genuine contact amid long stretches of comfortable but ultimately shallow fellowship. During this period, Wayne was dealing with something that almost no one around him knew about in its full dimensions. There had been a situation years earlier, during a period when a career had been in a complicated place, and his personal life even more so, involving a decision he had made that had consequences for someone else. The details of this are important not for their specifics, but for what they meant to Wayne, which was that he had acted in a way that contradicted everything he told himself and everyone else about who he was. He had protected himself at someone else's expense. He had chosen his own interests over someone else's welfare in a moment when the choice could not be undone afterward. And he had spent a significant portion of the years that followed pushing this fact down beneath the surface of his days. The person he had wronged was not famous. This is perhaps part of why the story has never fully come out. Why it exists in the margins of history rather than at its center. The person was a man who had worked adjacent to film industry, who had trusted Wayne in a specific and consequential way, and whose trust Wayne had broken not with any dramatic gesture of betrayal, but with something quieter and in some ways worse, which was a simple decision to look away, to not speak up, to allow something unfair to happen, because speaking up would have been costly. Wayne had told himself for years that it hadn't been that serious. He had told himself that things had worked out acceptably in the end. He had told himself that the other man had surely moved on, that the wound had healed, that the absence of visible damage was the same as the absence of actual damage. And then something happened that made all of those comfortable stories impossible to maintain. He found out that the man had died, and that in the years before his death, the man had carried what Wayne had done, or rather what Wayne had failed to do, as one of the defining injuries of his life. Someone who had known both of them told Wayne this. Not to be cruel, but because they thought he should know, and the information landed in Wayne with the specific violence of a truth that has been successfully avoided for a long time, and has therefore had years to grow in the dark. He couldn't undo it. That was the particular torture of it. The man was gone, which meant that the apology Wayne had never offered would never now be received, which meant that the debt would remain permanently unpayable, permanently present. He began to understand in those weeks following that knowledge something that younger men don't fully grasp, which is that some guilts are not resolvable, they are only livable, and that living with them requires a different kind of courage than the kind he had spent his whole career representing on screen. He didn't tell anyone. For a while, he held it the way he held most things, alone and without visible signs of strain. And the people around him noticed nothing because they were looking for signs they expected, and Wayne was very good at not providing those. But Martin noticed. Martin noticed because Martin had developed, across years of watching people carefully from behind his own carefully maintained facade, a sensitivity to particular quality of a man carrying something unshared. He didn't push. He didn't ask. He simply created, by his presence and the specific quality of his attention, conditions in which it would be possible for Wayne to speak if he chose to. It took months. It took the accumulation of many evenings in many different places and a gradual wearing down of resistance that had been built over decades. It took, in the end, one specific night in a specific room when the distance between what Wayne was carrying and what he was able to continue carrying alone finally closed entirely. They were in Wayne's study. This was not the desert location shoot, not some glamorous Hollywood venue, but a private room in Wayne's home, a room that reflected the man's taste with its dark wood and its accumulation of objects that meant something to him, and the quality of privacy it held was different from any public space. Outside the windows, the night was doing something complicated with clouds, and the light from the city was diffused and strange. Martin had come for reasons that were ordinary, a conversation about a potential project, a drink between friends, the kind of evening that fills the calendars of men in their profession without necessarily meaning very much. But there was something in Wayne that night, some quality of contained pressure that Martin registered the moment he arrived. They talked about other things for a while. The project, mutual acquaintances, the specific complaints and satisfactions of their working lives. Wayne was drinking more than usual, not dramatically, not to the point where it changed his speech or his bearing, but enough that Martin noticed the pace of it. And at some point in the evening, the conversation snagged on something, a name that came up in passing, a reference to a time and a place that Wayne had a particular connection to, and Wayne went quiet in a way that was different from his other quiets. Martin set his glass down. He didn't say anything. He just looked at Wayne with the particular quality of attention that had always been one of his gifts, steady and unhurried and completely without judgment, and waited. What happened next is something that the few people who were told about it afterward described with consistent quality of awe, not at the content of what was said exactly, but at the fact of it, at the image of this man, this monument of American cinema, this walking symbol of a particular idea of manhood that had shaped a culture, doing something so contrary to everything he had ever performed in any medium that it seemed for a moment almost unreal. Wayne put his glass down on the side table. He stood from his chair, and then, slowly, with the deliberateness of a man who has decided something irreversible, he lowered himself to his knees on the floor in front of where Martin was sitting and looked up at him and began to speak. He didn't ask for forgiveness directly. At first, he talked about what he had done. He talked about the man whose name had come up, about the history between them, about the decision he had made in that particular moment of pressure and self-interest, about what he had understood afterward and what he had refused to understand for far too long, and about what he had learned when he found out the man had died. He talked for a long time, in the way that people talk when they've been not talking for years, the words coming in chunks and pauses, some of them practiced in the privacy of his own mind, and some of them arriving in that room for the first time, strange even to himself. Martin didn't move. He sat very still in his chair looking down at this man on his knees, and his face, by all account from those who heard about this afterward, was doing something unusual. The habitual ease, the protective smoothness, had dropped away entirely. What was visible instead was something much older and more complicated. He was listening with his whole self in a way that very few people ever got to see from Dean Martin, because very few people ever said anything to him that required it. Wayne got to the part he had been building toward. He talked about the guilt. He talked about how he had managed it badly for too long, using busyness and achievement and the sheer momentum of a life lived at full throttle as a way to avoid sitting still with what he had done. He talked about what it meant to be a man who was supposed to embody a certain kind of courage and to know privately that in a specific and important moment he had failed it entirely. He talked about the debt that could no longer be repaid and the way that knowledge lived in him. And then he said what he had come through all of this to the point of saying. He said that Martin was the only person he had ever told, not his wife, not his oldest friends, not a priest or a doctor or any of the other figures into whose professional care people deposit their heaviest things. Martin. He had chosen Martin. And the reason he had chosen Martin was something that he explained with simplicity that made it more devastating rather than less. He said that Martin was the only person he knew who he believed would understand without flinching, because Martin was the only person he knew who he was certain had his own version of the same weight, and who had learned to live inside it with a kind of grace that Wayne had never managed to develop in himself. He asked if Martin could forgive him, not on behalf of the man who had died, because that was not something Martin had the power to grant, and Wayne knew that. He asked Martin to forgive him for being the kind of man who had done a thing like that, for being the man behind the image who was not always equal to what the image promised, for spending so many years pretending otherwise. He asked, in other words, for the kind of forgiveness that has nothing to do with the specific incident and everything to do with the accumulated weight of being imperfectly human for a very long time. The room was quiet. Martin sat looking at Wayne on the floor in front of him for what was by any measure a very long time. His hands were in his lap, and he wasn't looking away, and he wasn't filling the silence with anything, not reassurance or deflection, or the quick, warm social ease that was a default in almost every situation. He was sitting inside the full weight of what Wayne had just said, letting it be what it was, not trying to make it smaller or more manageable or easier for either of them to bear. When he finally spoke, what he said was not what Wayne was expecting. He didn't say, of course, or it's all right, or I understand. He didn't move quickly toward comfort. What he said, in a voice that was quieter than his usual voice, stripped of its characteristic easy warmth and holding instead something rougher and more real, was that he had spent years carrying something of his own that had a similar shape, and that he had never said out loud to anyone either, and that the particular loneliness of that was one of the things he had grown most tired of. And then Dean Martin, who did not cry easily and had trained himself across decades of public life never to do so where anyone might see it, sat in that chair above his friend on the floor and allowed himself to feel the full weight of what was in that room between them, which was not just one man's confession and another man's absolution, but something larger, the collision of two versions of the same tragedy, two men who had spent their lives performing strength and arrived finally, in private, at the recognition that the performance had cost them both more than they had ever acknowledged to anyone. He reached down and put his hand on Wayne's shoulder, not to help him up, not as a gesture conclusion, just as a point of contact, just as the acknowledgement that he was there, that he had heard, that he was not going to look away. What Martin said next is a part of the story that the people who heard repeated most carefully, because it was the kind of thing that one said cannot be unsaid, and it changed both men in ways that were not dramatic or publicly visible, but were, in their quiet way, permanent. He said that the only thing he could offer that had any real value was the truth that he too had failed someone who trusted him, that he too had made decisions in moments of pressure that he was not proud of, that he too had carried the resulting guilt with more secrecy and less grace than the situation deserved. He said that he forgave Wayne not because he had any standing to do so on behalf of dead, but because he recognized in what Wayne had just done something that most men never found the courage to do at all, which was to say the true thing out loud to another person without softening it or redirecting it or giving him more comfortable shape. He said that what Wayne had just done on his knees was more genuinely brave than anything either of them had ever done in front of camera. And he said it not to console, but to mean it. And Wayne, who had spent 60 years developing an instinct for the difference, knew it was the latter. Wayne stood up. The room felt different than it had when the evening began, which is the most that can be said about any night that matters. Not that everything was resolved or that the weight had been lifted, but that it had been, for the first time, genuinely shared, and in the sharing had taken on a slightly different character. Not lighter, but more visible. Not gone, but no longer alone. They didn't talk about it again directly. This is important to understand about men of their generation and temperament. What happened that night was not the beginning of a series of increasingly intimate confessions. It was not the opening of a therapeutic process. It was a singular moment of truth between two people who spent most of their lives in various states of performance, and after they returned to the surface of their friendship and continued in the way they had been continuing, with their jokes and their shared professional world, and the easy shorthand of people who have known each other long enough to no longer require full sentences. But the people closest to both of them noticed, in the period that followed, something different in the quality of the friendship, something that hadn't been there before in exactly the same form. It was hard to name precisely. It showed up in small things. The way Wayne would sometimes catch Martin's eye across a room in a crowded social situation and hold it for a beat longer than courtesy required, as though checking that the other man was still there, still real, still present. The way Martin would, on occasions when Wayne was holding forth in a particular loud and performative way that was his social mode, occasionally say one quiet true thing into the middle of it that would slow Wayne down and make him look at Martin with an expression that the people nearby didn't quite know how to interpret. They were looking out for each other in the specific way of people who have seen each other without armor, not obviously, not with any sentimentality or display, but with a steadiness that was new. Both men were toward the later part of their careers by this point, past the absolute peak of their cultural dominance, though still very much present and powerful, and a particular quality of friendship that is only available to people who have reached a certain stage of life, who have accumulated enough regret to know its texture and enough joy to know that, too, was available to them now in a way it hadn't quite been before. Wayne's health began to decline before Martin's, and the way Martin handled this tells you something about what the night in the study had meant to him. He showed up in an industry and a social world where showing up when things were hard was not something that could be assumed. Martin showed up, not with grand gestures or public demonstrations of concern, but in the quiet, consistent way of someone who has decided that a particular person matters and has organized his behavior accordingly. He visited, he called. He found reasons to be in Wayne's company during a period when Wayne's company was increasingly defined by physical limitation and particular indignity of watching a body that served you magnificently begin to negotiate with you for smaller and smaller concessions. Wayne was not easy to be around in those years. The illness made him sharper in some ways, stripped of the buffer of robust health. The impatience and the stubbornness and the difficulty that had always been part of him were closer to the surface. Some people would call themselves his friends, found reasons to be elsewhere. Martin didn't. He sat with the sharp edges of it the way he had sat in the chair that night in the study, with patience and without flinching. There was an evening in what turned out to be fairly close to the end of Wayne's life when they were together again in that same study, and the particular quality of the light was similar to how it had been on that earlier night, amber and quiet and holding something. Wayne was in worse shape physically than he had been, and the effort of the evening was visible on him in a way it once would not have been. But his eyes were the same, still watchful and intelligent and full of whatever was that had always lived behind the image. He looked at Martin across the room and he said, without preamble, in a voice that was quieter than it had been in its prime, but still had the particular texture that had made it one of the most recognizable voices in American culture, that he was glad about that night, not comfortable about it, not at peace with everything it had contained, but glad that it had happened, glad that there had been one person to whom he had told the truth, glad that this had happened before it was too late for it to happen. Martin looked at him for a moment. Then he said something that made Wayne, who had not cried easily in his life and was not a man who reached for that particular release, go very still in a way that people go still when something true arrives in them and has to find its place. Martin said that he was the one who was glad, that having been trusted with what Wayne had trusted him with was something he had not taken lightly, something that had meant more to him than Wayne probably understood, and that the friendship between them, which was real and which had been built over years of shared work and shared laughter and shared membership in a particular vanishing world, was deeper for it, and that depth was something he would carry. He said it simply and cleanly and in the conversational register they always used with each other, not elevated into sentiment, but not avoiding it either, just saying it the way it was, and Wayne received it the way it was offered, without diminishing it and without making more of it than it was. John Wayne died in June of 1979. The public mourning was enormous, the kind of cultural event that comes when someone who has been woven into the fabric of a nation's self-image is gone, and the tributes were what you expect, full of images and achievements and a specific mythology that had accumulated over decades. Dean Martin said very little publicly. What he said was measured and warm, and gave nothing of the private man away, which was exactly what Wayne would have wanted and exactly what Martin understood. But the people close to Martin in the years that followed noticed something, on certain nights, in certain lights, particularly in settings that had the quality of intimacy and late hours and the accumulated weight of time. Martin would become very quiet in a way that was different from his other quiets. Not sad, exactly, or not only sad, but inhabited, as though he were in conversation with something internal that had no public equivalent, as though he were sitting still in a chair in that study with the amber light coming in and his hands in his lap, listening. He never told the full story to anyone, not in any form that became part of the record. The version of events pieced together here comes from the edges of things, from the account of people who knew both men well and were trusted with pieces of it, from the particular shape of a friendship that was visible to those who looked carefully even when its depths were not. The specifics may be imperfect. The essential truth of it is not. What remains after everything is this: two men who spent their lives performing a particular idea of what it meant to be a man found in each other, late and unexpectedly, permission to be something other than that idea. They found, in the specific privacy of one night and one room, the relief of being seen without the performance. And one of them found, in the willingness to lower himself to his knees in front of someone he respected, something he'd spent decades believing was the opposite of what he was. He found that the courage he had represented for 60 years, the kind that involves physical danger and decisive action and the suppression of fear, was not the only kind that existed. He found that there was another kind, harder in its way because it had no audience and offered no applause, the courage of saying the true thing out loud to another human being and trusting them to receive it. The courage of vulnerability without armor, of asking for something that cannot be demanded, of acknowledging that the gap between the man you appear to be and the man you actually was not something that destroyed you when it was finally spoken, but something that in the speaking became briefly bearable. John Wayne, who never broke on screen, who stood in 1,000 imaginary storms without bending, knelt on a wooden floor in front of his friend and said the hardest thing he had ever said in his life. And Dean Martin, who had spent his career making difficulty look effortless, sat very still and let the moment be exactly as heavy as it was, and did not look away, and did not offer easy comfort, and did not reduce it. This is not the story that either man would have chosen to have told. They were both intensely private people who understood the value of what was kept hidden, and the control they exercised over their public images was deliberate and lifelong. But sometimes the truest things about people live in exactly the spaces they most carefully guarded, in the rooms no camera entered, in the conversations no journalist heard, in the moments when the performance stopped, and what was left was just two human beings in a room with all their weight between them. Whatever unresolvable guilt John Wayne carried for the man he had failed, whatever it cost him to carry it, whatever relief, if any, came from finally saying it out loud, belongs to him and cannot be fully known from the outside. What can be known is that he chose to say it, that he chose a specific form of saying it that he chose, and that the person he chose to say it to was worthy of that choice, received it with the full weight of his presence, and carried it afterward with a particular faithfulness that distinguishes a friend who was actually there from the ones who only thought they were. The screen goes dark eventually on every great performance. What survives it, if anything survives, is not the image but the person, not the myth but the man, not the thing that was performed for others, but the thing that was said once in private in a room that smelled of old wood and night air and the accumulated weight of a life. John Wayne fell to his knees in front of Dean Martin and told the truth about himself. And the truth turned out to be not the end of something, but the beginning of the only kind of peace that was still available to him. Small, private, shared, enough